Title: The Stars Align as Much as Our Sleep Schedules, by Jydaria and Lacrow. Summary: A night shift bartender and a morning shift barista didn't have much in common, but somehow they made it work. A coffee shop AU. Damien wasn't sure what compelled him to nab breakfast from the nearest 24/7 diner outside Berlin University. Maybe it was to not empty out the fridge so as to not make another shopping trip. Maybe it was boredom of the monotony college had lulled him into. Whatever his reason was, that didn't explain why Anya Forger slid into the seat across from him. "Sorry to keep you waiting," she declared loudly, although there was no crowd to speak over, earning a sour look from the elderly waitress. Even if Damien was a morning person, there were some things that weren't meant to be dealt with so early, and he worked the coffee shop's morning rush, so that was saying something. He must have made a face, because she mumbled, "Just go along with it, please," through gritted teeth, faking a smile all the while. Barring the two of them, the only other customer was another college student, who looked like he'd seen better days. "We have class together." Damien's eyes flicked back to meet hers. He insisted on walking me home, but he's had a bit too much to drink. Well, there went his appetite. "Problems like that aren't because of the alcohol," he grumbled back and wrapped up the greasy remains of his now brunch, throwing some money on the table. The waitress didn't seem to care that he wasn't paying properly. If anything, she seemed to be almost happy for them leaving early, or rather, as happy as her frown allowed. "Come on, let's go home. You smell like vomit." Like her initial statement, Damien said it loud enough to be heard in the entire diner. Though she smiled, he saw the violence burning in her eyes, waiting to be unleashed, and here he was doing her a favor. Once they were far enough outside the diner, he cast a look over his shoulder to check if they were being followed. They were not. "You didn't go with your roommates or anyone?" Moreover, she was hardly dressed in clubbing attire, but maybe that was in fashion these days. Or maybe she was cold. He wouldn't know. "I'm a bartender at Pascal's on 100,000 Way," she filled in blandly. For all their high school acquaintanceship and his distant knowledge of them both attending Berlin University, Damien couldn't say he expected that of her. "Becky works there too, but I work later than her, so she goes back first and actually sleeps while I get to deal with the night crowd." It can't be any worse than a horde of cranky, groggy college students before their coffee with, "Not enough whipped cream, could you redo this, please?" he griped. Because it wasn't every day he got to talk with someone other than his coworkers about having a job in customer service. "I'm a barista at the Midnight Cafe," he explained when she crooked an eyebrow up. "Anyway, where's your apartment?" He'd have to do some mental math to see how long of a detour this would be, and if he'd be late for work. "You don't actually have to walk me home. I'm sure you have better things to do with your time." There it was, the way she behaved differently than everybody else, completely unable to read the mood. It had been a long time since they last spoke, though since they weren't even classmates anymore, in a sense, he had to admit she got better at recognizing some cues. She did approach him to avoid someone after all. He didn't blame her for being wary. "I won't follow you to your unit, I'll just drop you outside the building. If you showed up in the news for dying in a ditch from clumsiness, it'd weigh heavily on my conscience." Not that he'd admit the real reason why he was worried. "Why don't you go boil some leaves, you mean bean?" He couldn't tell if he preferred his new nickname over the previous one she coined for him. Tea is the superior drink, yes. They bickered the entire way until Anya came to a stop. "Don't blame me if you lost any brain cells accompanying this peasant home." For the first time that night, even if it was ever so slightly, she gave him a genuine smile before entering the building. It was strange to see her go with such a finality after their chance encounter so long after high school. "Wait." He was surprised she turned around in the doorway. He was surprised he spoke up at all. It was probably the fatigue. It wasn't like he had anything in particular in mind to say. "Tell you what, are you working tomorrow?" She nodded. "So am I. I'll buy you breakfast to pay you back for the trouble, if you want. My number is the same as it was in high school."
To say that his life revolved around being a barista would have sounded extremely sad. So instead, he just told people he had insomnia. In truth, Damien's sleep schedule was nowhere close to that of a normal human. He usually went to bed sometime around 6 p.m., only to get up an hour or two past midnight to get ready for work. He had to be at the shop around 3:30 a.m. to help set up for the morning rush, meaning that he really didn't have all that much free time to himself. Lately even less so, considering he often found himself hanging outside a bar waiting for it to close. He'd stand there, feigning impatience, and suddenly perk when a pink-haired girl came stumbling out the doors 2:30. Unlike everyone else coming out, she wasn't drunk, just tired from another long day of work. Ever the gentleman, Damien would give her crap as she hopped to his side. On this particular night, he pulled no punches. "You owe me breakfast," he revealed tersely. The night before, he paid, so it was her turn. Was Anya's only response. Damien raised a brow when he realized there was little banter between them that evening. Anya was quiet for most of the walk over to the diner. Usually, she was loud and had plenty to talk about after just having come off her shift, but now all that energy was nowhere to be seen. He kept his musings to himself, though, and simply led her inside once they arrived. Anya and Damien took up a booth by the window, the latter dodging a glance from the usual surly waitress as they sat down. It wasn't long before the waitress came to take their order. Eggs and sausage for Damien, and pancakes for Anya. The usual. She came and went, leaving the pair to themselves once more. Being one of the few people in the diner, their mutual silence was deafening. Damien shifted in his seat. "Rough night?" Anya yawned. "Boring, actually. It was slow, which makes me sleepy." "Must be nice," Damien scoffed. There were no slow mornings at his cafe. "When you live off tips, not really," Anya replied flatly. She folded her arms on the table and placed her head on top. Damien shrugged. She had a point. He got tips too, but at least got a normal wage on top of that. Anya, on the other hand, seemed equal parts tired and put out, so for once he opted to hold his tongue for most of the evening. It stayed like that, he and her looking out the window in silence, until the waitress returned with their food not long after. She dropped the plates off with a thud before walking away, not even asking if they wanted refills of their drinks. Damien glowered. Why the hell did they even come here again? Anya dug in. Damien was surprised to find her halfway through her stack of pancakes before he was even done cutting up his sausage. He blinked. She inhaled. By the time he looked back and got a few bites in, Anya was already done. Her fork hit the plate, and a sigh escaped her as she went to wash it all down with water. Again, Damien kept any comments he had to himself. After that, Anya checked out. Not in a rude sort of way. For once, the night all answered the call of sleep. Perhaps it was Damien's own fault for taking his time eating, though he supposed even if he had rushed, Anya still would have passed out like a light. Breakfast over, he leaned back in his seat and shook his head at the sight. Anya had her head tucked into her arms once more, and a soft snore escaped her as she drifted off to sleep. "Together?" A dry voice summoned Damien's attention. He looked over to find the portly waitress standing there with a check in her hand. "I assume?" Damien's eyes narrowed. Technically, the answer was yes, but he didn't appreciate the inflection in her words. He also didn't appreciate the fact that it seemed breakfast was on him again, though there was little that could be done about that part. His glare softened as he glanced at Anya and saw the exhaustion on her face. He sighed as he fished out his wallet. A minute later, and the waitress returned with his card. As much as he just wanted to call a taxi and throw Anya in the back seat so he could go to work, Damien quickly shot the idea down. He still called the taxi, except he also climbed in after managing to get her inside. The woman was dead to the world, and he had to make sure she got home safe. The driver chuckled as they took off, and asked Damien if his girlfriend was a lightweight. It was a good thing Anya was asleep, otherwise she would have given him crap for the blush on his cheeks.
It was far too early for this, or more like he was late. His body clock must have reverted to its old habits because he slept through his new alarm. The sun wasn't out yet for him to be able to tell, but somehow Damien knew even before checking his phone. The bar was closed already, and he wouldn't have expected her to wait there for him. She didn't. Overall, it even balanced the time in his favor. Plus, he could nab something at the cafe without needing to buy breakfast for that diner. He didn't even like the food there, but checked there anyway. So why was he in such a slump? His manager noticed his mood and put him to making drinks instead of manning the register. Hey, Damien? He turned but kept an eye on the bagel in his hand to make sure it wouldn't burn as he cooked it for a customer. We don't carry peanut milk, do we? He blinked wearily at Ewan for a moment before ducking to check the fridge. Nope, as he thought. He stood back up to find out just who had made such a specific alternative milk request, only to see an oddly familiar face. One Damien wasn't expecting to see that day, at least. Almond? Soy? Cashew? Anya shook her head so many times he was surprised she wasn't dizzy. Oat? Coconut? From behind, another co-worker tapped Damien on the shoulder. Damien, how long has the bagel been in here? Crap. He left sorting out Anya's order to Ewan and pulled the bagel out. Salvageable, of course, but a little too crisp in the lightly toasted department. Well, the chocolate chips were melty, so it had to count for something, right? He shoved it in a paper bag with garden veggie cream cheese. If fruit could go with chocolate, why not vegetables? Plus, he didn't get paid enough to do more than squint and reread the order screen during the morning rush. Needless to say, after that, Emil traded off with him, leaving Damien to finish off drinks and sort out the pickup station. I'm surprised people don't hover and wait around in front of the counter for their order, Anya commented, doing exactly that. Damien grumbled. You didn't even get 6 hours of sleep. You look like you'll keel over at any minute now. He didn't bother to actually answer her point. Damien looked at the name on the coffee in his hand and called it out. Dante. That's what the caffeine's for, right? Anya replied. I bet you'll fall asleep in class anyway. Through banter and drink assembly, Damien worked on autopilot. All the while, Ewan and Emil from behind continued to send gossipy looks amongst themselves. Damien checked the name for the next order and happened to fixate on a minor detail while doing so. A quad shot? Nope. He still didn't get paid enough to actually think about their choices, or what he was enabling. Olivia. Even when students who probably weren't even that tall ordered drinks like this, it didn't change a thing in his mind. Quad shot? Anya questioned once the girl left. 4 shots of espresso, Damien replied. Most people draw the line at a triple. Supposedly you should only have 5 a day, tops. Wait, was that too much whipped cream? If the lid still fit, it was fine. Anya hummed. Oh, so how I feel when I see people downing more than 10 shots in a row then. Damien's blank look must have been enough to tell Anya he had no frame of reference to fully understand what she was saying. Damien effectively closed the subject when he slid her drink over to her. I woke up early for this. It better be worth it. You didn't even have peanut milk. She looked at the cup. My name is spelled wrong. She took a sip anyway. Damien shrugged before moving on to the next drink. That sounds like a you problem. Sounds like bad customer service. What if I complain to your manager? Anya grinned wryly before amending. I'm joking. I would never. Thanks for the coffee. Brutiful. She winked. Honest to God, winked. It was too early for this. By the time the morning rush died down, giving way to a few brunt stragglers, Damien still didn't quite feel like he had properly rebooted. So, Ewan began. Damien may have slammed down the smoothie blender lid a bit too loudly. Drop it. I didn't even say anything yet. He didn't need to. They all knew it. I didn't know you kept in touch with Forger. You're not on social media, so it's not like you would keep up with Black Bell or anything. But you two seem pretty casual just now. Have you been meeting up with her before work? Emil picked up in Ewan's place, wiggling his eyebrows for good measure. Breakfast at that crappy diner in the middle of the night isn't even worth being called a date. It's nothing. Immediately, Damien realized he had said too much, which his friends capitalized on. Whose side were they on? Having breakfast together in the middle of the night. Right after her bartending shift, then. Oh, so is that why you changed what days you work to match her schedule? The two boys collectively awed, and Damien channeled his embarrassment to scrubbing away at the counter grime. Psst, Ewan, do you think he still meets with her even on days he doesn't have work? Emil fake whispered. Cute couple goals. What do you think Becky has to say about it? Ewan already had his phone out. He was just playing, right? Right? Better safe than sorry. Don't you dare. Damien lunged, and may or may not have knocked over a tall stack of lids from the shelf in the process. Yikes. Needless to say, their manager wasn't amused, but wasn't harsh on them either, and they quietly returned back to work. For now. Maybe if he slept earlier that day, he could avoid the inevitable teasing that would resume at his apartment. Or he could give them a new topic to talk about. Damien decided as he prepared a chocolate bagel with garden veggie cream cheese during their break.
Loud music, dull neon lights, the stench of sweat of alcohol. God, Damien hated it all. It was one thing to pretend and tell people that he had insomnia, but it was another thing entirely to actually have it. At least, that's what he assumed anyway. There was no other explanation why, instead of going to bed at a proper hour to get ready for work, he found himself sitting at the counter of Anya's bar. Patrons sat on either side of him, all caught up in their own conversations, while he sat hunched and staring down at his drink. Occasionally, Damien would look up from his unsweetened tea. Anya didn't have any time to bring him sugar. And he'd stare at the aforementioned bartender as she went about doing her thing. At any given point, she was talking to several different people at opposite ends of the bar, while also making 2 or 3 drinks and ringing up people up on the register at the same time. To call it controlled chaos would have been embellishing it. There was nothing controlled about anything. And yet, Anya seemed to handle it all somehow. Truthfully, Damien was impressed. His own job had him making ludicrous concoctions at early hours in the morning, but at least he didn't have to make 12 at a time. And all different kinds, too. Come on! I've been waiting forever. A grating voice suddenly came from Damien's side. Hurry up! Sure, let me grow a third arm real quick. Anya shot back immediately. She didn't even look up from the register screen. Damien glowered at the man beside him. He was thankful it was dark. Otherwise his cold stare would have been all too noticeable, even in the crowd. He said something else, but Anya didn't even pay attention the second time. She was busy keeping the bar afloat by herself, and the rest of the patrons seemed happy with her performance. By the time the rude customer had waved at her and mouthed a third accostation, he was silenced with a flash of drink in front of him, so quick that the liquid inside sloshed around and some spilled out. Your gin martini, sir, Anya hissed through clenched teeth. Dry as my fucking bank account. She shot the man a look that could kill death itself, and then proceeded to bounce around the rest of the bar top. Damien watched her go. His eyes lingered on the sight of her as she walked away, a dumb grin on his face as he glanced over to find the man beside him shushed and subdued. The rude bastard sipped on his drink and, finding it to his taste, cleared his throat and stared down at his phone as he drank. Not a peep came from him for the rest of his stay. And it stayed that way. Anya busy, people demanding, until the time came to wrap up for the night. All in all, a long, stressful night, or at least that's how it seemed to Damien. Anya fared far better than he would have, though. By the time the last of the rabble were ushered out and he was the lone person left sitting at the countertop, Anya plopped down beside him, looking somewhat chipper. She splayed out her tips for the night and started to count it all. A huge haul of ones and a few fives. When I go out to eat, people think I'm a stripper. Anya grinned tiredly, motioning to all the ones in front of her. Now that the lights were on, the bags under her eyes were painfully apparent. The waitress at the diner doesn't think you're a stripper, Damien commented offhandedly. Then again, she probably just assumes we're broke and homeless. We're college students. Sounds about right. Anya shook her head. She continued to count. Damien watched. His attention wasn't on the stack of cash, but rather the girl counting it all. He could tell just from a quick glance that she wasn't in the best shape. The night's excitement probably had something to do with it, but that seemed only part of it. Her skin was a little clammy, and she seemed tired. More so than just the bags under her eyes. The distance in her stare told Damien that she wasn't all there. Anya wasn't just tired. It looked like she hadn't been taking good care of herself lately. He withheld any comment until Anya was finished. Then, once he was sure she wouldn't lose her place, he spoke up. "Are you hungry?" "Always," Anya nodded. She placed the last $5 bill on its respective stack and contemplated. "I'm thinking French toast today." "I think maybe some real food would do you some good," Damien countered. Anya thought again. "Maybe eggs and bacon?" "What about dinner?" "You mean steak and eggs?" Anya scrunched her face up. She didn't think the diner had that. Damien sighed and shook his head. Anya never failed to test his patience. "No, I was thinking like actual food. You know, like vegetables and stuff." Anya scoffed and Damien raised a brow. "No offense, Damien, but I don't think I want a salad from that cheapo diner." "I could make you one." The words left Damien's mouth before he had time to process them. Before he knew it, Anya was looking him square at him with a raised brow. Immediately, red dusted his cheeks. I mean, if you want one, I guess I could throw something together or whatever." "You don't have to go through the trouble," Anya shrugged. She collected her money and threw it all in her wallet. "Breakfast is fine." Damien paused. He glanced at Anya again, and again he found her looking worse for wear. She was exhausted. Damien imagined the guy from earlier heckling her despite her not feeling well, and his blood boiled. He offered once more. This time, he was adamant. "I'm making you dinner." Anya blinked. She stared at him for a moment, not saying anything as Damien stared back. She seemed frozen. Then, slowly, her lips wormed into a smile. "I'd like that." Flustered face, stomach tight, Damien suddenly looked and felt like a kid on his first date. Though this was most certainly not a date, and Anya most certainly didn't think of it as such. That's what he told himself, at least. Even as they made their way out of the bar and he texted his boss to let him know that he was sick, he wasn't. After that, he called a taxi. Much like the night where he stowed her in the back seat, Damien opened the door for Anya. Except this time, she made it inside herself. She slid all the way over and patted the seat next to her. Damien was just planning to sit on the other end, but sure, why not? The taxi driver was silent the whole ride over. Maybe he'd worked the bar close shift enough times to know when not to make small talk, especially when there was a boy and girl sitting close to each other, both reeking of alcohol. The ride itself wasn't eventful, though. Perhaps he was surprised there wasn't anything lewd going on in the back seat. If anything, Damien aspired to be the perfect gentleman. Hands in his lap the whole time, staring straight ahead, while Anya gazed tiredly out the window. It wasn't long before they made it to Damien's apartment complex. It figured he'd live off campus, or at least that's what Damien imagined was going through Anya's head at the time. If she mused as much, she didn't say anything. She simply paid the taxi with some of her cash, and Damien led them upstairs. A moment or two later, and they were walking through his front door, into the bare-bones decorated studio that was his home. "Cozy," Anya commented with a smirk. "Tiny," Damien retorted. "But I suppose it beats a dorm room." Anya wouldn't argue with that, not that she had the strength to. With a long exhale, she threw her purse to the side and hopped onto the lone couch in the living room space. She landed with a soft plop, while Damien went around her to make his way over to the kitchen. "Give me a few minutes," he instructed. "I'll throw something together real quick." Anya must have passed out almost immediately, because there was no response from her. She simply lay face first in the soft cushion, and Damien went to work. He figured greens and vegetables weren't exactly part of her usual diet, so he'd focus on that. Nothing some store-bought salads couldn't fix. Luckily, he stocked up on those throughout the week, so there was enough for the two of them. They needed something else for the main course, though. He looked in the pantry, and found it looking pitiful. He checked the top part. SpaghettiOs. Better than nothing. At least they had meatballs in them. He really needed to do some grocery shopping. With a sigh, Damien went about the arduous task of emptying the can of pasta into a bowl to heat it up. It wasn't arduous. While that cooked in the microwave, he got the salads ready and made them look at least presentable. He emptied them onto 2 plates, and when the microwave beeped, he did the same with the SpaghettiOs. Bon appetit, Damien announced dryly as he returned to the living room. The smell of food must have wrapped Anya awake, because by the time he placed her plate in front of her on the small pine wood coffee table, she was already pulling herself out from the couch. She rubbed the blear from her eye and looked down at the mirror. Messy hair clung to her cheek. "What's this?" "Dinner." Damien sat down on the floor, plate in hand. "An Italian dish my mom used to make me all the time." Anya blinked a few times and grabbed her food. She stared intently at it. "Damien, these are SpaghettiOs." "Right." "I love you." Damien nearly spit out his SpaghettiOs. Red filled his cheeks as he looked towards Anya, but she was already inhaling the food he made her. Damien stared for a moment, thinking there was going to be more to it than that, but he quickly found he was mistaken. Clearly, she didn't mean that. It was a joke. Duh, stupid. Regardless, Damien found his appetite suddenly lacking. He picked at his dinner, and both he and Anya remained silent throughout. It wasn't until he heard a fork hit the plate that Damien looked over at Anya again, this time finding her leaned back against the couch. A satisfied sigh escaped her lips, and she sighed in content, eyes closed. "Thank you for dinner." The words sounded almost too innocent coming from Anya. "I really appreciate it." "Of course," Damien nodded. He cleared his throat and looked away. "Anytime." "Don't say that. I'll never leave," Anya replied. Her smile was obvious, even if he couldn't see it at the moment. The blood again rushed to Damien's face. He glanced in Anya's direction from the corner of his vision, but to his astonishment she was already nodding off. Head rolled back, the smile remained on her face as she dozed off like she had once before at the diner. The woman could sleep like no one else Damien knew, and if it weren't for the fact that she'd had a long day, he would have had half a mind to shake her awake. But he didn't. In the end, all he could do was keep on being a gentleman. Picking her off the couch without waking her ended up being the easy part. The hard part was dragging her over to the neatly folded bed in the corner of his studio flat. Anya was dead weight and somehow felt way heavier than someone her size should have been. He growled as he chucked her onto the bed. His goal was to be gentle, but screw it. Damien fetched a blanket. He tossed it over her. The moment she felt something warm touch her skin, Anya grabbed the soft cover and absently curled into it. A snore escaped her, and before Damien knew it, she was truly dead to the world. Nothing would wake her. He sighed. There was no way he was getting any sleep that night. 1, because someone was currently using his bed, and 2, that someone was Anya Forger. The thought alone was enough to make him commit to skipping class later that day. He wouldn't be able to focus otherwise. No, Damien just returned to the couch that Anya had sat at and took up another blanket. He laid it over himself, despite having no intention of passing out, and from his corner of the room he looked over at Anya. She lay peacefully asleep, still smiling as she clutched one of his pillows. Damien lingered on the sight. He came to a quick conclusion. No more eating out for breakfast or dinner.